In 1985, one of the most successful companies on earth looked at its best-selling product, the thing millions of people loved, and decided to destroy it on purpose. And somehow, America cheered. But that wasn't even close to the strangest thing happening that decade. The 1980s was an era where grown adults trampled each other over dolls, sprayed enough chemicals into their hair to punch holes in the sky, and genuinely believed their cassette tapes were hiding satanic messages. These weren't fringe ideas, they were everywhere. And the deeper you look, the weirder it gets. Let's start with that company, because the new Coke disaster is still studied today as one of the greatest blunders in business history. For decades, Coca-Cola had been losing ground to Pepsi, especially in those famous blind taste tests where people kept picking the sweeter rival. So, executives panicked. They spent millions reformulating their secret recipe, made it sweeter, slapped a new label on it, and announced to the entire country that the original Coke was gone forever. The backlash was instant and almost unbelievable. People hoarded cases of old Coke. They formed protest groups. They flooded the company with furious phone calls, treating it like a national tragedy rather than a soft drink change. Within about 3 months, Coca-Cola surrendered and brought back the original as Coca-Cola Classic. A company had picked a fight with its own customers and lost spectacularly. But strangely enough, the public meltdown over a beverage was nothing compared to what people were willing to do over a doll. In the winter of 1983, America lost its collective mind over Cabbage Patch Kids. These were soft, slightly lumpy dolls that came with adoption papers and their own names, and somehow they became the most desperately wanted object in the country. Stores could not keep them in stock, and when shipments did arrive, the scenes were genuinely frightening. Parents shoved, screamed, and clawed their way through crowds. There were reports of fistfights breaking out in aisles, of people getting injured in the stampedes, of store employees using baseball bats just to control the mobs. All of this for a doll. To outsiders looking back, it seems almost cartoonish, but at the time it was treated as a serious cultural event, covered on the evening news like breaking national headlines. And the doll mania did not stop there, because soon kids wanted the exact opposite of something cute. Right on the heels of those wholesome adoption dolls came Garbage Pail Kids, a series of trading cards that parodied them with gross, grotesque, and genuinely disturbing characters. Think dolls melting, exploding, and doing things no parent wanted to explain. Children could not get enough of them, trading and collecting like tiny merchants, while schools across the country started banning them outright. It perfectly captured the strange contradiction of the decade, where one moment everyone wanted the sweetest thing imaginable, and the next they were obsessed with the most revolting cars they could find. But while kids were busy trading monsters, the adults were busy doing something to their hair that would make future generations gasp. The 1980s did not believe in subtle hair. The bigger, the taller, and the more gravity-defying, the better. Women teased their hair into towering shapes, and men grew mullets that proudly declared business in the front and party in the back. None of it would have been possible without industrial amounts of hairspray, and the weapon of choice was aerosol cans wielded like fire extinguishers. People emptied entire cans just getting ready for a single night out. The problem was that these sprays were loaded with chemicals that scientists later linked to damaging the ozone layer, the very thing protecting the planet from the sun. So in a very real sense, a generation was quite literally spraying holes in the sky just to keep their bangs standing at attention. And the hair was only half of the look, because the clothes were making an equally loud statement. If you wanted to look powerful in the 1980s, you needed shoulders the size of a door frame. Shoulder pads exploded in popularity, stuffed into blazers, dresses, and even casual sweaters until everyone looked like they were ready to play linebacker at the office. The trend was fueled by glamorous television shows full of wealthy, scheming characters, and by the rise of women entering the corporate world who wanted to project strength and authority. The result was the famous power suit, An outfit that practically shouted ambition before the person wearing it even spoke. It feels almost comical now. The idea that confidence could be measured by how wide your jacket made you look. But people took it completely seriously, and your status did not end with the suit. It extended to the jacket you wore over it. There was one piece of clothing in the early 1980s that instantly told everyone you had arrived, and that was the members-only jacket. The name alone did all the work, hinting at some exclusive club that did not actually exist. It was just a thin jacket with a little strap at the collar, but marketing convinced an entire country that owning one made you part of something special. Millions were sold, and for a while it was the ultimate symbol of being cool. Then there were parachute pants, those shiny, baggy, zipper-covered trousers made popular by break dancers, worn by kids who could not actually break dance but desperately wanted to look like they could. Fashion in the 1980s was less about comfort and more about sending a signal, and people bought into those signals completely. But clothing was not the only place where appearances ruled. The decade was about to turn the human body itself into a full-blown obsession. Somewhere in the early 1980s, America decided that the only acceptable thing to do was exercise in public, in the tightest, brightest spandex available. The aerobics craze swept the nation, powered by celebrity workout tapes that families played religiously in their living rooms. Suddenly, everyone was doing high kicks and grapevines in neon leotards, headbands, and the strangest accessory of all, leg warmers. These fuzzy tubes were originally meant for dancers to keep their muscles warm, but somehow they escaped into everyday fashion, worn by people who had never danced a step in their lives and had no intention of starting. Folks wore leg warmers to the mall, to school, to parties, completely disconnected from their original purpose. It was fitness as fashion, and fashion as identity, all bundled into one sweaty, colorful package. And speaking of bodies, there was another obsession that turned out to be far more harmful than anyone realized. In the 1980s, having a deep, dark tan wasn't just attractive, it was practically a moral virtue. A bronze glow signaled health, wealth, and a life of leisure, so people chased it relentlessly. They slathered themselves in baby oil instead of sunscreen, deliberately frying their skin under the sun for hours. Tanning beds boomed into a massive industry, with people climbing into glowing coffins of ultraviolet light on a regular basis, convinced they were doing something good for themselves. The idea of a tan being dangerous barely registered. Pale skin was something to be embarrassed about, and the darker you got, the more admired you were. Today, the health risks are well understood, but back then, the pursuit of color overrode common sense entirely. And that willingness to ignore obvious dangers showed up in what people were eating and drinking too. The 1980s were oddly obsessed with the word diet, slapping it onto everything while ignoring the bigger picture. Diet sodas became a cultural fixation, with people drinking them by the gallon and treating them as a magic solution. At the same time, cigarettes were still glamorized everywhere, advertised by rugged cowboys and elegant celebrities as symbols of sophistication and freedom. People smoked in restaurants, in offices, on airplanes, often right next to the very diet soda they were sipping to stay healthy. The contradiction was enormous, yet nobody seemed bothered by it. Then came wine coolers, sweet fizzy drinks marketed with folksy charm and friendly old men in commercials, convincing adults that alcohol could be wholesome and breezy. It was a decade of feeling healthy without actually being healthy, and that gap between belief and reality was about to get a whole lot stranger and a whole lot darker. If the fashion and food were merely ridiculous, what came next was something else entirely, because the 1980s were gripped by a wave of genuine fear known as the Satanic Panic. Across the country, ordinary people became convinced that secret cults were hiding everywhere, abducting children and performing dark rituals in plain sight. The hysteria reached into preschools, courtrooms, and living rooms, fueled by sensational talk shows and frightened parents. Wild accusations spread with almost no evidence behind them, and innocent people had their lives destroyed by claims that later collapsed entirely. It seems hard to believe that an entire nation could be swept up in such a thing, but the fear was treated as deadly serious at the highest levels of society. And one of the strangest targets of all that fear was music. People became convinced that rock and heavy metal records contained hidden satanic messages, secretly recorded backward into the songs. The theory was that if you played certain albums in reverse, you would hear evil commands sneaking into your subconscious. This led to one of the most bizarre cultural battles of the decade, with worried parents forming a powerful committee that pushed for warning labels on music and even dragged the issue in front of Congress. Famous musicians had to sit and defend themselves against claims that their songs were tools of the devil. The idea that listening to a record forward could somehow program your brain backward was taken seriously enough to spark national hearings. But music was not the only innocent pastime that got swept into the panic. A fantasy game played with dice and pencils became public enemy number one for a surprising number of people. Dungeons and Dragons, a game where players imagined adventures and slayed make-believe monsters, was accused of luring children into witchcraft, violence, and worse. Concerned groups formed specifically to warn parents about its supposed dangers, claiming the game could drive kids toward dark obsessions. Television specials and worried news segments treated a board game as if it were a genuine threat to the nation's youth. Looking back, it is almost unthinkable that imagination and storytelling could be branded as evil, yet for a stretch of the decade it absolutely was. And while some people were busy fearing the dark, others were chasing a very different kind of spiritual trend. The 1980s saw an explosion of New Age beliefs that swept through living rooms and bookstores everywhere. Suddenly, crystals were everywhere, sold as tools that could heal the body, balance energy, and even change a person's luck. Celebrities openly talked about past lives and channeling spirits, lending mainstream credibility to ideas that would have sounded outlandish a decade earlier. There was even a massive coordinated event where thousands of people gathered at supposedly sacred sites around the world, convinced that the planet was entering a new age of enlightenment on a specific day. People meditated, held crystals to the sky, and waited for a global shift in consciousness. Whether it was fear of demons or faith in healing rocks, the decade had a remarkable appetite for the supernatural. But underneath all of this spiritual searching was a much more worldly obsession driving the entire era. More than anything, the 1980s worshiped money and the people who flaunted it. A new breed emerged called yuppies, young urban professionals obsessed with status, designer labels, expensive cars, and the latest gadgets. Greed wasn't seen as something shameful. It was practically celebrated, packaged as ambition and success. And lurking beneath the glamorous parties of the wealthy was a darker trend that far too many treated casually. Cocaine was widely viewed as a glamorous, almost harmless party accessory, glorified in films and nightclubs as the drug of the successful and sophisticated. People genuinely believed it carried little risk, a dangerous misconception that took years and countless ruined lives to correct. The decade chased excess in every form, convinced that more was always better and that consequences were someone else's problem. When you put all of it together, a strange and vivid picture of the 1980s emerges. It was a decade where a soda recipe could spark national outrage, where dolls caused riots, where people sprayed the sky full of holes for the sake of tall hair, and where fantasy games were feared like genuine evil. What seems absurd to us now was simply daily life back then, taken completely seriously by millions of otherwise sensible people. And maybe that's the real lesson hiding inside all this neon and hairspray, that every era believes its strangest habits are perfectly normal, right up until the moment the world moves on and starts to laugh. And there you have it, a tour through the wild, baffling, and unforgettable trends that defined the 1980s. From new Coke to backward records, from leg warmers at the mall to crystals held up to the sky, It was a decade that committed fully to whatever it believed in, no matter how ridiculous. If you enjoyed this strange trip back in time, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the trends history would rather forget. Because the past is always weirder than we remember, and there is plenty more where this came from.